The December snow fell steadily across the Montana Territory as 10-year-old Billy Carson sat shivering on the courthouse steps, his thin frame wrapped in a coat 3 sizes too large and his bare feet barely covered by boots, held together with twine and hope. The orphan boy clutched a piece of paper in his frozen hands, the final rejection from yet another family who had decided they didn't want the responsibility of raising someone else's child. Billy had been living in the territorial orphanage for 8 months now, ever since his parents died in the influenza outbreak that swept through the mining camps like wildfire. The grim institution housed 43 children in conditions that barely met the minimum standards for human habitation, overseen by administrators who viewed their charges as burdens, rather than precious young lives deserving of care and opportunity. "Boys got no prospects," muttered Judge Harold Wickham as he descended the courthouse steps, his expensive coat and well-fed appearance contrasting sharply with Billy's obvious poverty and neglect. No family connections, no inheritance, no particular skills or talents that anyone's identified. Just another mouth to feed until he's old enough to fend for himself. The casual dismissal of a child's worth based solely on financial considerations was typical of the attitudes that governed territorial child welfare policies, where orphaned children were viewed as problems to be managed rather than individuals. With inherent value and unlimited potential, the orphan boy ain't got no family, ain't got no rights, agreed Sheriff Tom Morrison, stopping to light his pipe while discussing Billy's situation, as if the child weren't sitting close enough to hear every cruel word. Best thing for everyone would be if he just disappeared into the wilderness and stopped being a burden on decent tax-paying citizens. Billy's green eyes filled with tears at the sheriff's heartless suggestion, but he had learned during his months in institutional care that crying only made adults more irritated with his presence. Instead, he pulled the oversized coat tighter around his shoulders and tried to make himself invisible, while the 2 officials continued their discussion of his worthless existence. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of a tall figure on horseback, someone riding through the falling snow with the kind of confidence that suggested familiarity with harsh weather and difficult terrain. Through the swirling flakes, Billy could make out a man who appeared to be in his 60s, with silver hair beneath a weathered hat and the kind of upright bearing that spoke of a lifetime spent in positions of responsibility and command. Samuel. Hartwell dismounted from his horse with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades in the saddle, his keen blue eyes immediately taking in the scene of 2 well-dressed officials discussing the fate of a shivering child with obvious indifference to the boy's welfare. Samuel was the owner of the Triple H Ranch, one of the most successful cattle operations in 3 territories, but more importantly, he was known throughout the region as a man whose integrity and moral courage had earned him respect from everyone, who valued character over mere financial achievement. "Gentlemen," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying easily through the falling snow despite its conversational tone. "Fine day for conducting business outdoors, wouldn't you say?" Judge Wickham looked up from his discussion with obvious irritation, clearly annoyed at being interrupted in what he considered a private conversation about municipal administrative matters. "Mr. Hartwell," the judge replied with forced politeness, "this is just routine business regarding the placement of institutional children. Nothing that need concern successful ranchers like yourself." Samuel's gaze moved from the 2 officials to Billy, taking in the boy's obvious poverty, his inadequate clothing, and the resignation in his young face that suggested he had grown accustomed to being discussed as if he were property rather than a human being deserving of respect and consideration. "Institutional children," Samuel repeated thoughtfully, his tone suggesting that he found the terminology somehow inadequate for describing the reality of the situation. "Would I be correct in assuming that you're discussing this particular child's future?" The boy's been rejected by 3 potential families, Sheriff Morrison explained, with the casual indifference that characterized his approach to most administrative duties. Nobody wants to take on the expense and trouble of raising someone else's child, especially one with no prospects or connections that might make the investment worthwhile. The purely economic analysis of a child's value as a potential family member struck Samuel as profoundly wrong, reflecting attitudes that reduced human relationships to financial calculations rather than acknowledging the intrinsic worth of every individual. "What's your name, son?" Samuel asked gently, kneeling down to Billy's level so they could speak eye to eye, rather than forcing the child to crane his neck to look up at another intimidating adult figure. "Billy Carson, sir," the boy replied quietly, his voice showing the careful politeness that institutional children learned as a survival mechanism when dealing with adults who held absolute power over their daily existence. "Billy," Samuel said, with genuine warmth, "I'm Samuel Hartwell, and I own a cattle ranch about 10 miles north of here. How would you feel about coming out to see the operation, maybe staying for dinner and meeting some of the folks who work for me?" The unexpected invitation from a stranger was so startling that Billy could barely process what was being offered. In his experience, adults rarely showed interest in his welfare unless they wanted something from him, and genuine kindness from powerful people was essentially unknown in his limited experience with the world. "I don't have anything to give you in return, sir," Billy said honestly, his institutional upbringing having taught him to be suspicious of adults who offered things that seemed too good to be true. Samuel smiled at the boy's cautious response, recognizing the wisdom that unfortunate experience had forced upon someone far too young to need such defensive strategies. "Son," Samuel said gently, "sometimes people do kind things just because it's the right thing to do, not because they expect payment or favors in return. Would you be willing to trust me enough to find out whether that might be true?" Judge Wickham intervened before Billy could respond, his voice showing annoyance at having his administrative procedures disrupted by what he viewed as sentimental interference from someone who didn't understand the practical realities of child welfare management. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Wickham said with barely concealed irritation, "I appreciate your charitable impulses, but this boy is a ward of the territorial government. Any placement arrangements must go through proper legal channels and official procedures." "Of course, Judge," Samuel replied respectfully, though his tone suggested that he had little patience for bureaucratic obstacles when a child's welfare was at stake. "I'm not suggesting anything improper or irregular. I'm simply offering to provide temporary care while you determine whether a more permanent arrangement might be beneficial for everyone involved." The reasonable tone of Samuel's request made it difficult for the judge to refuse without appearing heartless in front of witnesses, but his expression showed reluctance to approve any arrangement that might set precedents for other wealthy citizens. Interfering in territorial child welfare policies. "The boy would still remain under territorial supervision," Judge Wickham said finally, his voice showing the grudging acceptance of someone who recognized that Samuel Hartwell was not a man to be dismissed lightly. Any arrangement would be temporary and subject to review by appropriate authorities. Samuel nodded his agreement to the judge's conditions, understanding that bureaucratic face-saving was sometimes necessary to achieve practical results that actually benefited the people involved. "Billy," Samuel said, turning back to the boy, who had been watching this adult negotiation with understandable anxiety, "what do you say? Would you like to spend some time at the Triple H Ranch and see whether ranch life might agree with you?" Billy looked up at Samuel's weathered face, searching for signs of the deception or hidden motives that his experience had taught him to expect from adults who made promises that seemed too generous to be real. "Yes, sir," Billy said quietly, his voice carrying a note of hope that he had almost forgotten how to feel. "I'd like that very much." as Samuel helped Billy onto his horse and they prepared for the journey to the Triple H ranch. The boy found himself wondering whether this might be the beginning of something better than the institutional existence that had been his only reality since his parents' death. The snow continued to fall as they rode away from town, but for the first time in months, Billy felt warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with shelter from the weather and everything to do with the possibility that somewhere in this harsh world there might actually be adults who cared about children's welfare more than bureaucratic procedures and financial calculations. The Triple H Ranch emerged from the swirling snow like something from a dream, its substantial buildings and well-maintained corrals speaking of prosperity earned through hard work and careful management rather than inherited wealth or political connections. Billy pressed closer to Samuel on the horse's back, his young eyes taking in the sight of the most impressive operation he had ever seen, complete with dozens of cattle, a remuda of fine horses and several outbuildings that suggested the kind of diversified agriculture that characterized truly successful frontier enterprises. "Welcome to the Triple H," Samuel said warmly as they approached the main house, a two-story log structure that managed to be both imposing and welcoming despite its size. "It's not fancy by city standards, but it's been home to me for 37 years, and I think you'll find it comfortable." The house itself was a revelation to Billy, whose experience with adult living spaces had been limited to institutional dormitories and the cramped quarters of mining families struggling to survive in harsh conditions. Samuel's home showed evidence of prosperity, but more importantly, it radiated the warmth that came from being a place where people were genuinely cared for, rather than merely housed and fed. "Mr. Hartwell," Billy said hesitantly as they dismounted in the ranch yard, "I need you to know that I don't know anything about cattle or horses or ranch work. I might not be much help with whatever needs doing around here." Samuel chuckled at the boy's honest assessment of his limitations, recognizing the integrity that made Billy want to contribute rather than simply accept charity from someone who had shown him unexpected kindness. "Son," Samuel said gently, "the most important qualification for ranch work is willingness to learn and the character to do your best, even when tasks are difficult or unfamiliar. Everything else can be taught to someone who has the right attitude." As they entered the house, Billy was greeted by Maria Santos, Samuel's housekeeper and cook, whose maternal warmth immediately made the boy feel more welcome than he had felt anywhere since his parents' death. Maria was a woman in her 50s whose own children were grown and scattered, and her face lit up with genuine pleasure at the prospect of having a young person to fuss over and care for. "Ay, Dios mío," Maria exclaimed, taking in Billy's obvious hunger and inadequate clothing with the kind of maternal concern that transcended cultural and linguistic differences. "This poor niño is half frozen and skinny as a fence post. Come, we get you warm food and proper clothes before you catch pneumonia." The fussing attention from a caring adult was almost overwhelming for Billy, who had grown accustomed to the institutional approach that treated children as administrative problems rather than individuals deserving of personal attention and affection. Over the following days, as Billy gradually adapted to life at the Triple H Ranch, he began to understand that Samuel Hartwell's operation was successful not just because of its owner's business acumen, but because it was run according to principles that valued people, as well as profits. The ranch hands were treated with respect, paid fair wages, and given opportunities for advancement based on their abilities and dedication, rather than their social connections or family background. "Billy," Samuel said one morning as they worked together mending fence in the north pasture, "I want you to understand something important about how we do things here. Every person who works for the Triple H is part of our family. And family members look out for each other, regardless of their official position or responsibilities. The concept of being part of a family was almost foreign to Billy after months of institutional care, but he could see evidence all around him that Samuel's words weren't just empty sentiments, but actual operating principles that governed how people treated each other at the ranch. "Mr. Hartwell," Billy said carefully, "I appreciate everything you've done for me, but I need to know what happens when Judge Wickham decides it's time for me to go back to the orphanage or get placed with another family." Samuel paused in his work and looked directly at Billy, his weathered face showing the kind of serious consideration that the boy's question deserved. "Son," Samuel said quietly, "what would you think about the possibility that you might not have to go anywhere else? What would you think about staying here permanently as my adopted son and heir to everything I've built?" The offer was so unexpected and so generous that Billy could barely comprehend what was being proposed. The idea that someone would want to give him not just a home, but an actual inheritance, was beyond anything he had dared to imagine during his darkest moments of despair. "You mean you'd want to adopt me legally?" Billy asked, his voice showing wonder at the possibility of having a real family again. "Even though I'm just an orphan with no family connections or prospects?" "Billy," Samuel said with gentle firmness, "you're not just anything. You're an intelligent, hard-working young man with unlimited potential, and I'd be honored to have you as my son." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of visitors riding up the ranch road at high speed, their urgent pace suggesting either important news or serious problems that required immediate attention. Through the settling dust, Samuel could make out Judge Wickham, accompanied by Sheriff Morrison, and two men he didn't recognize, all wearing the kind of grim expressions that usually preceded unpleasant official business. "Samuel Hartwell," Judge Wickham called out as the group approached, his voice carrying the authority of territorial law. "We need to discuss the boy's situation and some concerns that have been raised about this arrangement." Samuel straightened to his full height, his instincts warning him that Billy's temporary sanctuary at the Triple H was about to be challenged by forces that viewed the boy as property rather than a human being deserving of protection. "Gentlemen," Samuel replied calmly, "you're welcome on my property, but I expect any discussion about Billy's welfare to be conducted with respect for his dignity and his right to have a voice in decisions affecting his future." "The boy has no rights in this matter," Sheriff Morrison said bluntly, his words causing Billy to move closer to Samuel's protective presence. "He's a ward of the territorial government, and placement decisions are made by appropriate authorities based on what's best for the community as a whole." The casual dismissal of Billy's human rights revealed the cold, bureaucratic thinking that had characterized most official approaches to his case, but Samuel's response showed that such attitudes would not go unchallenged at the Triple H Ranch. "Sheriff Morrison," Samuel said with dangerous quiet, "every human being has inherent rights that can't be dismissed by governmental convenience or administrative expedience. Billy may be young, but he's still a person deserving of respect and consideration in matters affecting his life." One of the unfamiliar men stepped forward, his expensive clothes and calculating expression marking him as someone with financial interests in the proceedings. "Mr. Hartwell," the stranger said with false courtesy, "I'm Edgar Blackston, attorney for several territorial business interests. We have concerns about your unauthorized adoption of a ward of the state, particularly given the financial implications of such arrangements." The mention of financial implications revealed that Billy's situation had attracted attention from people who viewed his potential inheritance as something that should be controlled by established interests, rather than awarded to someone with no political connections. "What financial implications?" Samuel asked sharply, though he suspected he already understood what was driving this sudden official interest in Billy's welfare. A valuable ranch like the Triple H represents significant territorial assets, Judge Wickham explained with obvious reluctance. There are questions about whether such resources should pass to someone with no established ties to the community or demonstrated ability to manage complex business operations. The barely concealed attempt to prevent Billy's adoption because of his potential inheritance revealed the true nature of the opposition they were facing, and Samuel's expression hardened as he understood that this battle would be about more than just one boy's future. "Gentlemen," Samuel said with steel in his voice, "Billy Carson is going to be my adopted son and heir, regardless of your concerns about territorial assets or community connections. If you want to challenge that decision, you're welcome to try, but I suggest you come prepared for a fight that you might not win." The confrontation in Samuel's ranch yard stretched taut as a bowstring as Judge Wickham and his companions realized they were facing a man whose determination to protect Billy was absolute and whose resources were more than adequate to fight any legal challenges they might mount. The boy stood close to Samuel's side, drawing strength from his protector's unwavering resolve, while struggling to understand why adults were so interested in preventing his adoption by someone who genuinely wanted him as a son. "Mr. Hartwell," Attorney Blackstone said, with the oily persuasion that characterized lawyers who specialized in manipulating legal procedures for the benefit of wealthy clients, "surely you understand that adoption decisions must be made in the best interests of all parties involved, including the territorial community that has invested resources in the boy's care." Samuel's laugh was harsh and bitter, containing no trace of humor, as he processed the attorney's attempt to frame Billy's potential adoption as somehow contrary to community interests. "Invested resources," Samuel repeated with dangerous calm. "You mean the resources that have kept Billy in an overcrowded orphanage with inadequate food, clothing, and education? The resources that have treated him like a burden rather than a precious child deserving of love and opportunity?" The accuracy of Samuel's description of institutional conditions made Judge Wickham shift uncomfortably, as he recognized that defending the territorial orphanage system would require him to justify conditions that violated basic standards of human decency. "The territorial system does its best with limited resources," Judge Wickham said defensively, though his voice lacked conviction when faced with the obvious evidence of Billy's improved health and happiness during his weeks at the Triple H Ranch. "Limited resources," Samuel said thoughtfully, his tone suggesting that he was considering the implications of the judge's statement. "Judge Wickham, I happen to know exactly how much money the territorial government allocates for child welfare, and I also know how little of that money actually reaches the children who are supposed to benefit from it." The threat implicit in Samuel's words sent visible alarm through the group of officials, as they began to understand that challenging a man of his resources and connections might expose institutional corruption that they preferred to keep hidden from public scrutiny. Billy watched the adult confrontation with growing understanding that his future was being determined by forces that had nothing to do with his welfare and everything to do with power struggles between people who viewed him as a symbol rather than a human being. "Mr. Hartwell," Billy said quietly, his young voice cutting through the tension with surprising authority, "I want everyone to know that I choose to stay here with you. Not because of money or property or anything like that, but because you're the first adult since my parents died who has treated me like I matter." The simple declaration from a 10-year-old boy carried more moral weight than all the legal arguments and bureaucratic procedures that the officials had been discussing, and several of the men seemed genuinely moved by Billy's obvious sincerity. "Son," Judge Wickham said with surprising gentleness, "you're very young to understand the full implications of such important decisions. There are legal procedures and safeguards designed to protect children from making choices they might later regret. Your Honor, Billy replied with dignity that impressed everyone present. I understand more than you think I do. I understand the difference between people who see me as a problem to be solved and people who see me as a person worth caring about. Samuel felt his chest tighten with emotion as he heard Billy articulate the fundamental distinction that separated genuine care from institutional management, and he placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder to show his support. Gentlemen, Samuel said firmly, Billy has made his preferences clear, and I've made my intentions clear. If you want to challenge this adoption, you're welcome to take the matter to court, where I'll be happy to present evidence about the conditions. Billy has endured under territorial care compared to his situation here. The threat of public legal proceedings that might expose institutional failures was clearly something the officials wanted to avoid, and Attorney Blackstone began looking for face-saving compromises that might resolve the situation without embarrassing revelations. Perhaps we could arrange a trial period, Blackstone suggested, with the kind of diplomatic language that lawyers used when they realized their position was weaker than they had initially thought. A supervised placement that allows evaluation of the arrangement while protecting everyone's interests. No, Samuel said simply, his tone brooking no negotiation or compromise. Billy isn't going to live under the constant threat of being removed from his home based on the whims of people who have never shown genuine concern for his welfare. Either you approve the adoption or you fight it in court, but there won't be any trial periods or supervised arrangements. The absolute finality of Samuel's position forced the officials to confront the reality that they were dealing with someone whose resources and determination exceeded their own, and whose moral authority in the community made him a dangerous opponent in any public legal battle. Judge Wickham exchanged meaningful glances with his companions, and their silent communication suggested that they were reaching a decision based more on practical politics than legal principles or genuine concern for Billy's welfare. Very well, Judge Wickham said finally, his voice showing the resignation of someone who had been outmaneuvered by superior forces. Given Mr. Hartwell's reputation in the community and his obvious resources for providing appropriate care, I'm prepared to approve the adoption proceedings immediately. The sudden capitulation was clearly motivated by expediency rather than principle, but Billy didn't care about the officials' motivations as long as the result was his legal recognition as Samuel's son and heir. 6 months later, as Billy celebrated his 11th birthday, surrounded by the ranch hands and community members who had become his extended family. Judge Wickham's words about having no family and no rights seemed like echoes from another lifetime. The formal adoption had been completed with surprising efficiency once the officials decided not to oppose it, and Billy Carson had legally become Billy Hartwell, heir to one of the most successful ranches in 3 territories. But more importantly, he had gained something that no amount of money could purchase, the unconditional love of a man who valued him for who he was, rather than what he might become. Son, Samuel said during the birthday celebration, his voice carrying easily across the crowd of well-wishers who had gathered to honor the boy's special day. A year ago, some people said you had no family and no rights. Today, I want everyone here to know that you have both, and no one will ever again be able to dismiss you as unworthy of respect and consideration. Billy's response was to hug his adoptive father with the fierce devotion of someone who had learned to value genuine love above all other treasures, and his words carried across the celebrating crowd like a benediction. Thank you for showing me that families aren't just about blood, Billy said with maturity that impressed every adult who heard him. Thank you for proving that some people still believe children deserve love and opportunity regardless of where they come from. The orphan boy, who had once been told he had no family and no rights, had indeed been given a ranch. But more importantly, he had been given something far more valuable. The knowledge that in a world often characterized by cruelty and indifference, there were still people whose hearts were large enough to transform stranger into family and despair into hope. Years later, when Billy had grown into a successful rancher in his own right and was known throughout the territory for his generosity toward disadvantaged children, people would remember the day Samuel Hartwell proved that the most important inheritance wasn't property or money, but the love that transformed lives and created legacies worthy of the sacrifice they required. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more incredible stories of love, family, and second chances from the old West. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of believers in the power of compassion to change everything.